Welcome to the Millionaire Muslim podcast by IslamicFinanceGuru.com, where we talk halal investing, finance, entrepreneurship, and getting ahead in life. We're your hosts, Mohsin Patel and Ibrahim Khan. Assalamu alaikum everyone, Mohsin here from IslamicFinanceGuru.com. Hope you are all well. We really appreciate you guys tuning in, whether it's the first time you're listening to our podcast or whether you're a repeat listener. We really appreciate you joining us. Today's podcast is going to be delivered by Ibrahim, and it's about a really useful topic that we get asked about a lot, which is, can I have a career in investment banking as a Muslim? And Ibrahim is going to talk to you all about that. But before we dive into Ibrahim's podcast, I want to ask you one favor, which is I want you to subscribe to this podcast if you're not subscribed already. And if you haven't left us a review, please do leave us a review. These two things really help us to get in front of a bigger audience, which will help our podcast. Jazakallah khair. Now let's dive into the podcast.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Ibrahim. Welcome to the Millionaire Muslim podcast. Today we're going to talk about a topic that we get asked about very often, usually from university students, and that is the topic of, can I work in an investment bank, or can I work in the city as a practicing Muslim? And this is a topic that comes up absolutely every single year around the time that people start applying to university. And we thought we'd just lay out all of the various ins and outs in this podcast to give you something to go off. We actually have an article on this as well. We've got a few articles on this actually. And one of the good articles that we have is an article by a investment banker friend of mine who used to work at one of the bulge bracket city banks, investment banks, and now works for a boutique advisory firm. And so he had some very insightful comments into the whole world of investment banking. But I think the reason why it's so important for someone who's thinking about going into this world to decide now whether or not they're going to go any further is because the history of Islamic finance and the history of Muslims in the city is absolutely littered with people who went into investment banking and then realized a few years down the line that actually it's not really for them, A, because of the hours, and B, because they don't really feel morally that it's acceptable to do what they do. And these people then see the light, and you see many people then go into Islamic finance, and Islamic finance is populated by all of these people who've seen the light after going into a job that fundamentally was impermissible initially. And good. I mean, it's good for them that alhamdulillah they have seen the light. But it's important for people who haven't gone down that path that we can maybe save a bit of a career gymnastic move halfway through, rather than and so that you can go in from the start actually doing what you are morally comfortable with doing. And so I suppose that the very first thing to mention about investment banking is, what in the world is it? There's so much that goes on in the city that, frankly, I don't think even the people or the other people in the city necessarily know about. And this is partly because the things that are going on are highly complex and very fast-paced. And so even one part of the city, one office block may be doing stuff, but there might be an office right next door which that information will not be communicating to, and so it takes a while for the market as a whole for that information to percolate through. And so because of that, there's a lot of information silos, and it's sometimes quite hard to work out what in the world is going on in the city. And then I suppose the other reason why is because a lot of the deals that happen in the city are private deals, and by that I mean that they are behind confidentiality walls, and so you're not allowed to talk about them in public. So for example, I work as a funds lawyer. A lot of the deals that I work on, I will not publicly speak about my work with my law firm and about my clients, and that's because of confidentiality reasons that are strictly binding for the various people who are involved in the city. And so because of that makes it hard for us to work out what's going on. But in a nutshell, I think the best way to think about what happens is to divide up there are two halves almost of the city. One is the public half, and the other is the private half. And in the public half, you have people who are traders. So you see the pictures in the newspapers or in various different popular films. You see traders trading on the floor and shouting and screaming. That is all trading and stockbroking, and that is dealing with public companies, i.e. companies that are listed and their shares are publicly available to buy and sell. Then you have the private side of the city, and this is really what we're going to focus on more, because that's frankly where I think a lot of the money is as well, and that's where probably a lot of the focus is for people who are applying to the city. And here you have private deals, so mergers and acquisitions, or you have fundraising, so people want to take their private company and make it and do an IPO, list it on the stock exchange for the first time, or they might want to raise some debt, get someone to give them some money to borrow, and then they go ahead and they use that debt to do something with it. And so there's a private side, and then there's a public side. In the public side, as I said, there's trading and stockbroking and etc. And on the private side, you've got M&A and equity capital markets, which is what the IPO stuff is called, and you've got the debt financing as well. So that's, in a broad overview, that's kind of what's going on in the city. Now, there's so many other various ancillary structures and ancillary activities that are going on. Like, for example, I myself work in funds formation, and there is a whole ecosystem of private equity funds, and we can maybe do a podcast on this. I mean, if you want to hear a podcast on private equity funds, I'm happy to do one. I mean, this is something that I spend a lot of time looking at. So do drop us an email, Ibrahim@IslamicFinanceGuru.com, and let me know if that's something of interest. And if it is, we're happy to do one. But that's another whole subset of the city. And then you've got another subset of the city, which is the insurance world. Then you've got another subset of the city, which is the buy side. So various funds who have lots of money, who are doing trading either on their own, either for themselves or on other people's behalf. But we're focusing specifically on investment banking today. And so, with investment banking, there are, I suppose, 3 or 4 key Islamic fiqh principles to bear in mind right at the outset. The first is that you must not, of course, yourself trade in interest. You must not enter into a transaction that deals in interest. You must not witness a transaction that deals in interest. You must not help structure a transaction that deals in interest. You must not broker such a transaction. So, in other words, if you are working in the debt capital market sector, if you are working to help companies get debt, then that's just clearly and unambiguously haram. So that's the first thing. So witnessing a transaction and helping people and advising on a transaction where there's on a transaction of debt is fundamentally problematic. And by that I mean where the main focus of the transaction is debt fundraising. And so that's issue number one. The second issue, or the second point, really, is that where you are providing assistance after the fact, so where you are providing, for example, accountancy services, and you're coming in and you're auditing the accounts of a company, or you're auditing and giving a report, a due diligence report on stuff that is happening, and you're giving a factual statement. This is what our view is of what the circumstances are, and this is our considered opinion based on the various different regulations and accountancy codes, that this is what we think is the situation. That is fine, because you're not actually structuring any of the transaction. You're literally saying, here's some advice. We've been hired, so normally accountancy firms might be hired to give this advice, or even it might be other firms who are hired to give this specific due diligence advice, or specific regulatory or tax advice, or whatever it might be. And then finally you have, so the first thing is, you're right in the cold, you're at the cold face, you're getting stuck into knee-deep into interest-based transactions. The second is you're kind of coming in after the fact, or you're kind of at the peripheries. And then the third is where you are a professional entity that is coming in very much as a third party, and you're not really involved with the transaction at all. So like, for example, if you've got something that's being structured in the Cayman Islands, then stuff that happens there will need Cayman Council to be involved, or Cayman local Cayman bank, or a local Cayman M&A boutique, and they will be advising specifically on Cayman related stuff, and they're not necessarily that close to the actual transaction. And so because of that, that's largely fine, because there's a distinction there. So from a fiqhi perspective, then, if you are right in the thick of the interest-based transaction, that's a problem. If you are assisting by way of a professional service that is strictly limited to a certain set of parameters, and that is not necessary, or that is not at the heart of the transaction, then that is perfectly fine as well. And then finally, if you are very much at a distance, then that of course is fine as well. So you have these kind of general principles. Now, if you kind of apply these to the private and public sectors of the investment bank, what happens is, within the private side, you've got ECM, equity capital markets, and you've got DCM, debt capital markets. Debt capital markets is of course ruled out straight away. Equity capital markets, you've got bankers who are primarily helping a company do an IPO. That in of itself is, from a Shari'i perspective, is jaiz, it's halal, it's permissible. Now, where there can be some quite interesting quirks is if there's some kind of convertible bonds or convertible debt involved, or if there's preference shares being thrown around. All of this stuff then takes it into choppy waters from a Shari'i perspective. However, it kind of depends on deal to deal, but if the financing forms a very small part of the overall deal, then myself, I can live with you working in an equity capital markets role where incidentally, there might be some kind of financing that comes in here or there as part of certain transactions and certain deals. But broadly speaking, what you're doing is completely removed from any such financing. And remember, there's also an important point to be made here. Investment banks are service providers themselves. They are not necessarily always actually placing the debt. They're not necessarily doing the debt raising, although they often are doing that as well. But as an investment banker, as opposed to working on the trade floor, as an investment banker, your role is advising and your role is structuring, and it's very much an advisory role. And because it's an advisory role, and you're advising on M&A elements only, you as an investment banker with an M&A expertise are quite focused on that specific thing. And whilst there may be finance involved, there will be certain experts in finance who will be advising on that. And of course, if you're an expert in finance and you're advising on that, then I would be very concerned, and I wouldn't want to advise any Muslim to do that, because then you really are more directly assisting with an interest-bearing and haram transaction. So that's the private side. Debt capital markets, haram. Equity capital markets, it's much more cleaner. And within this, also one has to remember that every bank is different and every team is different, and teams change all the time. Situations keep on changing all the time. Deals are different. And so really, if you're going into this world of investment banking without any detailed Shari'i knowledge, that's an issue. And the best way to frankly deal with live matters and things that might come up, live issues that come up, is to have a basis in Islamic finance, to have a basis in Islamic financial law and Islamic jurisprudence, not to a degree level or anything, but you need to have certain principles in your mind that are very clear, because you will need to be making those decisions live at 3 a.m. in the morning, and that's why people who don't have that background, they really feel uncomfortable, because they can't see where they're heading from a fiqh perspective or Shari'i perspective, and then they feel lost, and the whole fun goes out of the entire job. And if you're in a job that you feel is unethical and un-Islamic and is going to cause you problems in the afterlife, then that is of course a big issue for people. So that's the private side. Then on the public side, you've got trading and you've got broking. I'm not really going to talk about broking that much because maybe it's a topic of its own. But trading, generally speaking, if you are trading equities, so you're trading long only equities. By that I mean you're just buying and selling shares as opposed to borrowing shares and then shorting them. I won't necessarily go into the technical details of what these things mean. Feel free to Google them, because I'm expecting that the kind of people who will be listening to this this far into the podcast will probably or should know what these things mean, because they are considering applying to an investment bank. So if you are shorting, then that's not permissible, and if you are trading in debt, if you're trading in futures, options, forwards, then those, the latter three, are grey areas. Debt is, of course, not a grey area. If you're trading in bonds, that's highly problematic and it's not allowed. And if you're trading in things that are borrowed, then that's not permissible. And so, in reality, where one ends up is to say that, frankly, any job in the city, in the trading, on the trading floor, which will also, by the way, involve a high amount of leverage. So, traders will be given a lot of borrowed money, because that will magnify returns, losses and also returns. So that overlay also adds, frankly, another element of haramness to the whole thing. But overall, if you're working in the city and you're working in a trading role, you're going to be doing a bunch of different things, and you're going to be doing at least some haram stuff in there. It's not really, to my mind, and do please correct me if I'm wrong, if you're listening to this and you have better experience of this yourself. To my mind, I don't think it's really possible to work in a on a trading floor or in a trading role in the city and also stick to your Islamic principles. And by the way, there's an article on Forex. So if you're doing any Forex trading, then my views still are, although I have sympathies for Forex, but ultimately my views still are that it is not permissible, at least at the retail end of the spectrum. Where you're trading on in Forex at the institutional end, and it is not leveraged, then of course it becomes almost akin to a currency exchange, and that in itself is fine. However, I would need to look into it more to opine on that with any gravitas or any real authority. So that's the kind of an application of the principles, the three principles that we talked about, to private and public sections of investment banks. One thing to now mention is a familiar question that comes up, which is, what if I work in a sub-department of an investment bank, such as HR or operations or compliance or something like that? Is that permissible? Well, my answer to that is really, I think, because you are working for an institution that is fundamentally geared towards, and look, if you are working for a company or a bank or a boutique advisory firm that isn't geared towards haram transactions, then the whole thing is fine, right? You can work as an investment banker, you can work as a compliance officer, you can work as whatever. But if you're working in a bank where 90% or a huge percent of the transactions that are bringing in the cheddar for the bank are haram, then working in compliance or working wherever, to my mind, is not something that I would recommend my brothers to do, or I would certainly do myself. And so I would stay away from that. But what about if you work in the asset management section of an investment bank? Or what about if you work in the equity capital markets team within the investment bank? I suppose the intuition behind that question is, can you segregate somehow between the profits that are made by different departments, and can you segregate somehow between, from a Shari'i perspective, working for a Goldman Sachs when one team is doing haram stuff and the other team is doing halal stuff? And the way I approach this question is, there's no hard and fast rule here, but the principles I would apply to this question are: is there a real distinction between that subsection, that subdepartment, and the rest of the bank? I.e., is there a different legal entity that holds that subdepartment? So there are sometimes really quite independent sections within, or subsidiaries within a bank's structure, within the bank's corporate structure, and to be owned by someone who is doing haram stuff is in of itself is not problematic. If I am funded, if my company is bought out by a bank and I retain a minority stake in that company, and I'm just, I just sell, tents, for example. I have an outdoor camping and outdoor travel kind of company, and a bank for some reason has taken over this company. Just because it's a bank that's a shareholder, that doesn't make the activities of the company haram. So by the same token, if there's a subsidiary within the bank's corporate structure which is perfectly permissible to work for, and its accounting and its profits and losses are very distinct from a bank, then that would, to my mind, be quite an easy way of saying, yes, that's fine to work for such an entity. But if there is really no distinction whatsoever, you're kind of sat in the same building, your bonuses are linked to the overall pot that the bank has for profit, for bonuses, and there are all sorts of other overlaps between you and your colleagues in the haram departments, then I don't think that that's really a justifiable analysis to make. And I know someone's going to be listening to this and they desperately want to work for an investment bank, but they're also kind of concerned about this whole Shari'i thing, and they're going to be thinking, they're going to be trying to trick their mind into making a distinction where there is none. So I would just say to you, just be honest with yourself about this, and try and be fair with your thinking on this. And I suppose that kind of brings me quite nicely onto one of the final points that I want to make today, which is, why, if you're practicing as a Muslim, do you even want to go into investment banking in the first place? And we, Mohsin and I, have done other podcasts, other podcast episodes on careers, so do check those out more generally about how you should think about from a Islamic perspective on what careers you do. But putting that aside 1 second, why do you want to go into investment banking in the first place? And I think the answer that most people give me when I ask them that is because there's nothing else that's as clearly defined, with a clear graduate recruitment program, quite an alluring and an informative campaign within universities, with so many different perks attached to working and interning at investment banks during the summers, and then of course it's incredibly well paid. And so, and it's also quite glamorous. And so all of those things come together, and people want to work in investment banks. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of herd mentality here as well, which is, if you are unsure about your future, which a lot of people are at university, then if an investment bank is saying, come to us, we will give you a well-defined and clearly defined career path. You are someone who's clearly very hardworking, because investment banks generally will recruit from the top universities, and you're quite academic, you've always had a goal, you've always been working towards a certain thing, your A-levels, your GCSEs, getting into university, your finals. All we're doing now is giving you certain new goals. You come in as an analyst, and then become an associate, and then become a manager, or whatever the various categories are. And so you're sold, and you go into investment banking. But just take a step back and think about what you're getting into, and think about why you're going into this stuff. Are all of the reasons that I've just mentioned really reasons that one should be deciding their career on? Do they really resonate with you as a deep and meaningful reason for going into a career? And to my mind, the answer is no. Now, what I'm not saying at all is that Muslims should not go into banking or the advisory world or the M&A world. I think the best way to do that is to work either in the buy side, so as I mentioned, the asset management side, where you work for long-only funds and you become an equity analyst. Because that is a much cleaner job. You're working for a company that is fundamentally doing halal stuff, which is just buying companies and then selling companies, or selling shares in companies. And the other halal area within the IB space is working for boutique advisory firms. So firms like Lazards or Perella Weinberg or Mazars or Moelis and Company, Evercore and others, who provide very specific boutique advisory only services. They don't have a balance sheet themselves. They don't fund the debt or book run for an IPO or anything like that. And so I would say those are probably the two ways to get into the city or into investment banking from a halal way. But before I encourage you to do that, I would genuinely say, take a step back and really think about what it is that you want to get out of your career and why. In order to have a successful career that is really fulfilling, and you don't end up divorced and hating your life and crying to your parents in the middle of the night, which I've heard stories about how people do this because they're that stressed and they've been working till 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning for weeks on end. If that's if you're going to make that commitment, you need to be jolly well sure why you're making that commitment, and there needs to be a few things that line up. The first is, of course, you should enjoy the work, you should be good at the work, but also there needs to be a really deep, meaningful purpose behind why you're doing this work. And if there isn't that purpose, then you will sooner or later start feeling quite jaded about your job. And I'm not saying that that you cannot find a purpose that would justify going into investment banking. I think you can, and if you can, then you certainly you should knock yourself out, go for it, as long as it's within the halal areas. But don't kid yourself just follow the crowd on this. And then I suppose the very final thing that I want to leave you guys with, which is, what about if you don't go into investment banking? What other things can I do in the city? And I'm not going to go into detail on these 5 ideas that I came up with, and maybe we can do podcasts on each of them. If you do want to see a podcast, again, drop us an email, Ibrahim@IslamicFinanceGuru.com, and we'll be happy to have a chat with you. So one idea is do a startup. If you're leaving university, it's the best time in the world. You've probably maybe even got a grad recruitment job or grad scheme job. That's ideal. Try and defer that for a year, and then make a run at trying to do a startup, because it's quite a low risk opportunity there with a high reward. If a startup comes off, then you are going to be extremely rich. But if a startup doesn't come off, then you are not really going to be disadvantaged in any way, and actually you're going to be highly advantaged, because you have real world experience when you go to interviews or when you progress in your career. So that's the first thing I would say. Genuinely get into startups. And IFG, Islamic Finance Guru, we're always encouraging startups. We try and match up people where there are synergies between investors and entrepreneurs, and we really do want to support you guys. So again, do get in touch, but also get stuck in, because this is where I think a lot of value can be added to our world. And from a Muslim perspective, that's what we want to do. We want to make the world fundamentally a better place, and we want to make humanity progress, and startups are a way that we can do that. The second is working in advisory firms, as I said, boutiques, boutique advisory investment banking firms. The third is working in the professional services. So this is law firms, accountancy firms, and other kind of audit firms that might be out there, where they're providing a specific service as opposed to being embedded within the whole transaction or leading on the transaction. Then you've got consultancy, so management strategy consultancy firms, and again, that's from a fiqh perspective. That's advice providing, a professional external third-party professional providing specific advice, and that's fine. And then finally, you have grad recruitment, graduate schemes from various different FTSE 100 or 250, FTSE 250 companies, large blue chip companies who have fantastic grad schemes where you will become a future captain of the industry, and genuinely I think a lot of people overlook that, but I think there's a great deal to be said about going into those kind of schemes, because you progress really fast if you're interested in business and you're passionate about your job, and you can always switch back into the other areas as and when you like, because you'll be gaining all of the key skills there. So there we have it, folks. Investment banking, lots of grey areas, few chinks of pure pristine white, but generally speaking, a lot of fairly haram activities going on. So overall, do your own due diligence, consult with your own conscience, and make sure that you have a purpose behind why you're going into investment banking in the first place. And then if you've got any further questions, then please do get in touch. And if you would like to see a course on this, maybe going into the fiqh things in more detail, maybe getting in a few investment banker friends of mine who can talk to you about the specifics of what happens and how to structure your career so you can actually make sure that you stay in the halal stuff, then again, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you, and maybe that's something that we can arrange. We can maybe do a course on that at some point. But Jazakallahu khairan, and Assalamu alaikum.